How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to Supra MK5. I'm here once again at Dead Slow Garage with a different type of Supra today. This, you might be able to tell, is a 2-liter. This is the new 2.0 turbo, which was just released. And so today we're going to go through the car and show you how it is similar and also how it is different from the 3-liter 6-cylinders that everybody knows so well already. So we'll start with just the outside of the car. The body is exactly the same. There's really not much to indicate that this is a 2-liter versus a 3-liter except for the wheels. As you can see, the wheels are a different design and they are actually an inch smaller. These are 18s rather than 19s on the 6-cylinder. And just a different design. And then if you look past the wheel, you'll see where the changes start to get a little bit more significant. The brakes on the 4-cylinder are a single piston floating caliper versus the 4-piston fixed caliper on the 6-cylinder. So that's just one of a few, I'll call them cost-cutting measures, but I mean the car is less expensive, so you have to save that money somewhere. And one of the places that they save the money is in the brakes. So it's still a pretty large brake design. The rotor still has a separate rotor and hat, so this is aluminum and this is cast iron. But the caliper itself is a single piston, one big one rather than 4 little ones. The brakes still work fine. I've tracked a 4-cylinder car a couple of times now and it still works. If you were to put a racing style brake pad and fluid in there, you can still get some pretty good performance out of it. I'll come back to why I actually like the fact that they put these brakes on the car in a little bit, but let's finish going around the car and looking at what other changes there are. In terms of the body, all the stuff we talked about in the last video about the 6-cylinder is the same. The aerodynamic little details like the roof there, the gurney flap under the mirror, that's all still maintained. The brakes in the back are the smaller of the two 6-cylinder models, so the base model brakes, which is a good match to the smaller front brakes as well. And the only other real change you can see on the outside of the car is the exhaust. You can see the tips are a little bit smaller and they're a different material. They're stainless steel, they're actually a little bit shinier. I kind of like the way they look better than on the 6-cylinder car. So I wouldn't call that a downside. Let's take a look at the inside of the car. So the overall design is pretty much exactly the same. There's some material differences here and there. The seat inserts look like they're made of Alcantara. Really the biggest difference in here is use of electronics. So these seats are mechanical. And as you can see here, you've got levers for all the different motions that the seat will do. You know, some people like to have the electronic controls, but I like the mechanical ones because that means it's lighter weight. And that's really one of the biggest differences from a chassis dynamic standpoint in this car is that it's over 200 pounds lighter than the 6-cylinder version. And most of that's going to be in the front end with the smaller engine. Speaking of which, let's take a look. So it looks mostly the same under here, and in fact the engine lid or the engine cover is almost the same, but it's just shorter. You can see there's a big gap here that there isn't on the 6-cylinder version. And the engine doesn't even go out this far. It's more like here. So if you compare that to where the shock towers are, that's going to give this car way less front end weight in front of the front axle. And that's going to improve turn in by a lot. And you can really feel it when you're driving the car. The front feels a lot lighter and more lively. And that's because there's less weight here and the weight is further back. If we take this off, you can see just how far back that engine really is. It doesn't start until about here. So that's going to be very, very good for the weight distribution of the car. Now this engine is an existing engine. This has been in other BMWs for a number of years now, which means there's already some tuning options on the market. In terms of power, this car makes 255 horsepower and 295 foot-pounds of torque. Now, 255 doesn't sound like a whole lot, but you got to consider that 295 foot-pounds of torque, that is a pretty big number, and that's going to play a way bigger role in the acceleration of the car. Horsepower is basically used to sell cars. Torque is used to win races. So the car is only about a second slower 0 to 60 than the 6-cylinder car is. So it's still not a slow car by any means. And I've been hearing the comparison a lot between this and the new BRZ or the new 86 is going to be coming out. This is definitely a faster car. Make no mistake. There are only a few differences underneath the car, but they are pretty important differences. So let's take a look at what's changed here. All of the underbody paneling, that's all the same. So the aerodynamics of the car are going to be just as good as the 6-cylinder. But take a look under here, way up in here into the suspension. First of all, you can see the inside of that single piston caliper. But what I really want to focus on right now is the shock absorber, way up in there. That is a non-electronically controlled, basic, simple, typical shock. No EDC cancelers necessary. You could put whatever shock absorber you want on this car and it's just going to work. It's not going to freak out the ECU because the ECU has no idea. It does still have a ride height sensor, so you will need to adjust for the ride height if you're changing that. But beyond that, you can just swap shocks as much as you please. So that's actually a really good thing. I like that a lot. If you look at the exhaust here, it's a little bit more simple, whereas a 6-cylinder splits off into 2 pipes and goes back, and then there's oval, and this is more simple. It's just 1 pipe. It is oval here, goes into what's either a second cat or a resonator, and then back into the muffler. And the muffler does still have an electronic control, so when you put it into sport mode, it is going to open up this side and give you louder, more crackly exhaust. But because the shocks are not adjustable, it's not going to be changing those. It's just going to be exhaust, probably steering feel, transmission tuning, things along those lines. And the differential you can see right here is also different. There's no big cooling fins on the back. But more importantly, there are no electronic controls here either. This is just a normal limited slip differential, mechanically actuated, no electronics. So again, you don't have any systems you need to trick. You can just put whatever diff you want in there and run with it. So this kind of brings me back to the point I was making earlier about why I like the fact that it has those smaller, less expensive brakes. This car is a way easier tuning base, and you're not paying money for parts that you're just going to change out anyway. If you're tuning a car for the track, you're going to be changing the shocks, you're going to be changing the brakes, you might even be changing the differential. And why would you want to pay for the fancy stuff if you're just going to pull it out and put other stuff in anyway? This car is set up, ready to go for you to just take out the inexpensive parts and put in whatever you want to make the car your own and make the car behave the way you want it to behave. So it sounds like, oh yeah, they're cheap parts, but no, I actually think it's a good thing because of who would be buying this version of the car. Okay, those are the mechanical differences between the two cars. Let's go take it out and see how it drives. All right, now we're in the car, headed up to the canyons to get an idea of how this car actually behaves as a driver's car. So dynamically, of course, this car is going to drive a whole lot like the 6-cylinder. The hardware is mostly the same except for the engine. But because there's so much less weight on the front and because the shock tuning and the spring tuning and all this other kind of tuning is going to be a little bit different, then it is going to have a little bit of a different personality. So let's figure that out. So just as a daily driver driving on the street, this car is really effortless. And I actually made this point to you before we were even recording. It's like everything on this car is just super easy. It's the transmission is incredibly smooth. It's got plenty of torque for driving around. Like you don't ever feel like you need to like really put your foot in it for normal traffic situations, which some other cars that have, you know, less torque like the 86. You kind of feel like you have to downshift just to do, you know, anything. You got to get the revs up. This car, you don't have that because it has so much more torque than it does horsepower. It really just kind of goes whenever you need it to go. I love the steering in these cars. I've always said that, and this is no exception to that rule. It's just the ratio is really fast, but it's also like the progression of the weighting on it. It just feels very natural. It's a fast ratio, but it's not difficult to turn on low speed maneuvers, and then once you get going quickly, there's still good feedback. And there's been people talking about how the Supra has really bad feedback in steering, and I don't get that at all. I feel like somebody said that once and then everybody's just started repeating it because I think the feedback in this car is great, and a big part of that is how quick that ratio is. And these cars have a lot of caster as well, and caster is a big part of where that feedback comes from. So yeah, I think the feedback's really good in the wheel, and having the lighter front end just makes that better. So at the moment, I'm just in standard driving mode. I haven't touched any buttons yet. I'm going to go ahead and put it in sport mode now, and I have a feeling it's going to downshift and the revs are going to come up. Let's see. Yeah, it immediately went down from 5th to 4th gear. The revs came up, and the exhaust got a little bit louder as well. So what that's going to do in this car, oh, and what good timing, this car's letting us by. In this car, what that's going to do is open the exhaust up. It's going to firm up the steering a little bit, and it's going to change the transmission and drivetrain tuning. So it dropped a gear to get the revs up, to get you more inside the power band, and it will hold gears longer, and it won't take as long to downshift when you get on the gas. So for instance, if I, coming out of this turn here, put my foot down, right away it's going to downshift. Whereas in standard mode, it wouldn't do that. It would kind of linger in that high gear for a little bit longer and say, you sure you want to accelerate? Fine. And then it would give you the lower gear. But sport mode, it's pretty intuitive. I mean, of course, you can shift with the paddles if you want to, but just for a spirited drive, like what I'm doing right now, it pretty much knows what I want. When I get on the brakes, it downshifts like it just did right there, and it holds that lower gear through the corner so you're ready to go to accelerate out the other end. Okay, so the characteristics of this car and also the 6-cylinder, it's kind of difficult to match it up to like the classic tuner cars you would think of, like a Silvia or a Miata or a Z or something like that. It doesn't really feel like any of those. But also, it doesn't necessarily feel like the BMW that it's sharing a platform with. It's kind of its own thing. And I've driven the Z4, including the 4-cylinder Z4, and it's really uninspiring, to be perfectly honest. Like, you're not getting very much feedback. The brakes are mush. It just wasn't really a great driving experience. This feels much firmer. This feels much like more willing to go. It feels like a sports car, where the other one felt like a luxury car dressed up as a convertible sports car. This actually feels like a sports car. All right, I'm gonna drop it down into manual mode and start to lean on the tires just a little bit. Okay, yeah, the front end feels really, really compliant, really willing to do basically whatever I want it to do. Yikes. 3 wide with a fire truck and a bicycle. What was I talking about? Yes. So the front end willingness to do what you want in this car is really, really good. I mean, it's not like it's bad in the 6-cylinder, but it's over 200 pounds, mostly off the front end. It's definitely very noticeable. Like, just it feels like the front's got more grip in general, which makes sense because there's less inertia up there. So once you approach the limits of the front tires, there's more to give. There's less weight there just trying to maintain its trajectory. An object in motion will try to stay in motion. Well, that means that the front end of the car wants to keep going straight as we go through this corner. And the less weight you have up there, the more easily you can get it to change direction with the front tire. So yeah, the front end definitely has a little bit more to give here. And its responsiveness. That's what most people are going to feel, is the responsiveness. You know, for a quick change of direction, how easily and quickly does it comply with what you want. So the biggest difference most people are going to feel between this and an 86 or a BRZ is obviously the power. And a lot of people will look at the power number of this and be like, well, that's not that much different, especially compared to the new BRZ. But what they're ignoring there is the torque. And the torque is really what makes the difference. So the torque on the BRZ is still less than 200. It's 184 foot-pounds. On this car, it's 295 foot-pounds. That is a big difference. Even if the horsepower isn't that much of a difference, the torque is huge. And that's what you're gonna feel while you're driving. And not just at the very top of the rev range. You're gonna have that extra kick the entire way through the rev range. And that's really the benefit of these modern turbo engines, is you can have a flat power curve and make power everywhere. And to be honest, that's both good and bad, because obviously it's going to make the car faster, and this is not a slow car. But the drawback is a lot of people, especially like the driving purists, like to have a peaky engine where all the power comes up way at the top. But in a car like that, you can't just put your foot to the floor and just have power immediately like that. And like as soon as it kicks from second to third gear, like you're pulling right away. And this is going to be a little bit controversial, but that's also a benefit of the automatic transmission. You don't have to close the throttle plate in between gears. So in a turbo car, that's a huge benefit because you're not blowing off all that boost. You're going to have power right away when you go to that next gear. Now, I am a little bit of a purist. I would like there to be a manual version of this car. I think it would be more fun to drive. Until they see fit to give us that, then this is what we got, and it works really well. It's the same transmission as a 6-cylinder car. The shifts are incredibly fast. The downshifts it does well, and even in automatic mode, in sport mode, it knows pretty much what you want to do. Unless you're, looking for that last tenth of a second, you could pretty much just leave it at automatic and it'll put you in the right gears at the right times. Okay, so I've been putting some thought into who would be buying the 4-cylinder version of the car, and I've come up with, I think, 2 answers. One is the person who loves the style of the car, wants to have a fun sports car that they can daily drive, and just can't make sense of spending close to $60,000. It's just not in their budget, or they're never going to utilize all that extra power or the braking capacity of the more expensive car. For that person, this car's perfect. Why waste the money on the extra stuff that you're not going to use in the first place when this car drives basically exactly the same? So that's person 1. Person 2 is somebody who wants an excellent tuning base. And this car is much more in line with the classic tuner cars of like the 80s and 90s, where you could just much more easily throw parts at it and have a good time. Because it doesn't have the electronic damper control, because it doesn't have an electronically controlled diff, it's not going to complain at you for swapping parts out and take away your, and put you in limp mode basically. So that type of person who wants to be able to swap parts and have some fun doing that, and then take that a step further, somebody who's looking for a really serious base to build a really serious style track car. This engine, the B48, this engine, the B48, has been around for a number of years now. There's already a bunch of examples of people tuning this engine and making a lot more power out of them. So just comparing this to a stock 6-cylinder, you could easily make that much power out of this engine with some tuning. So if you're going for matching the 6-cylinder for acceleration, but then also want to have the benefits of the 4-cylinder, like not wasting money on brakes you're going to change, not wasting money on shocks you're going to change, and having the lighter front end, then this makes a lot of sense as a tuning base. There's a thing that some manufacturers do called a body in white, which is where they will sell a version of their sports cars that forgoes all of the expensive stuff. Like they'll ship it on Steelies, it'll just have white paint, none of the interior components, etc. And they sell that to race teams who are just going to rip all that out anyway and put their own wheels on it. So why spend the extra money on stuff that you're just going to change? And that's kind of what this car would be to that sort of person. Don't waste your money on parts you're going to change anyway. All right, that's enough about the car. Let's do some spirited driving. Jay, turn on that Eurobeat.
5, 3,